The science is clear. Climate change is real. It is happening today, and it profoundly affects our health. We are experiencing more intense heat waves, droughts, and wildfires. Climate change increases the amount of airborne pollutants and results in higher ozone levels, leading to higher rates of asthma and cardiovascular disease. APHA's long-term vision is to create the healthiest nation in one generation, and addressing the health impacts of climate change is a critical step. We need your help. Please join us.
As members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we are called to be God's hands in the world. Whether it's caring for our neighbors, protecting our children, or seeking justice for the most vulnerable among us, it's our duty to go out in the world and change it for the better. Get involved with ELCA's Creation Care programs. Talk about climate change with your families, friends, colleagues, and local congregations. And inspire others to do what they can to protect our climate and this world that we call home. Please join us.
Good afternoon. My name is Geof Rochester, and I have the pleasure of hosting this next session at Eco America's Forum. And I have some wonderful guests. We're going to spend about 40 minutes together. And around the theme of the conference, we really want to have a frank conversation about what all of you could be doing. As Bob said, 2030, 2040 looked very far away years ago, and now they're upon us. And we are living in unprecedented times. And I think we've all learned a lot from the ability to mobilize the public, private sector, and government around the critical issue of COVID. I have with me three guests. I have Seth Goldman, the serial entrepreneur, and he'll tell you about his latest venture, but he helped to create Honest Tea, he helped to create Beyond Meat, and now he's got a new thing, so he's done this a few times. They call him the transformational entrepreneur. We have Katharine Hayhoe, and there's no question that science is at the foundation of the climate debate. But I would argue we as a community have not done the best job of communicating the science in a way where it's engaging, urgent, emotional, heartfelt. She knows how to do that, so you'll hear from her. And then Bishop Powell, and I was talking to him just before we went live about the fact that I love that Eco America it has made it its business to forge relationships with the religious community, because I think when we think about the discourse and the divide on climate, there's not enough representation and voices that appeal to large audiences. So with no further ado, I'd like to kick this off. I'll start with Katharine. And, there has been a discussion about COVID. And Katharine, I wanted you to talk about the learning from COVID, the nexus of COVID to climate. And as we look to the fall, because again, we want this to be very pragmatic. So as we look between now and the end of the year, how can we be using lessons from COVID, especially when it comes to communications and reaching the public? So over to you. And everybody should give 2 to 3 minutes about what you're about, and then jump in.
What climate change means to us in the places where we live. Climate change didn't cause the coronavirus pandemic, but climate change is, as the U.S. military actually calls it, a threat.
I think
today to notice the animals to humans by infringing on animal habitats, by changing the available food, by affecting our resources and more. How has the pandemic affected climate change? Well, it temporarily cut our carbon emissions and our air pollution, which is good news, but only temporarily and not nearly enough. What the most lasting lesson, I think, from the pandemic has been for us is that in such a polarized world where it seems like everybody's drawing lines in the sand to show us how different we are than somebody else right beside us, the pandemic has taught us that when it all comes down to it, what really matters is our health and our safety and that of our family and our friends and our communities, our companies, our states, our regions, our countries. That's what the pandemic threatens, and that is exactly what climate change threatens too. And that's why to care about climate change, we don't have to be a scientist or a liberal or a tree hugger or a certain type of person. All we have to be is a human, because it affects us.
Right, and Katharine, I kind of jumped the gun. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about you and what you're up to these days?
Oh, sure. So I am a climate scientist. I really am one of those people who study what's happening to our planet, how quickly things are changing, how humans really are responsible for what we're seeing, and for why it matters to us, because it affects every aspect of our health, our food, our water, our resources. It magnifies inequalities and injustices. Those who are already poor and vulnerable and marginalized are the most affected by a changing climate. And my work is driven in large part because of my faith. I am a Christian. I believe that we are to care for those less fortunate than us. I believe that from the beginning of the Bible to the very end, it talks about how we have a responsibility to care for every living thing on this planet. And if we truly took what we believe seriously as Christians, we would be out at the front of the line demanding climate action.
Great. And on the topic of religion, Bishop Powell, why don't you introduce yourself and talk about what you're up to these days?
I'm Staccato Powell, and I am currently serving as the Bishop of the Western Episcopal District for the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And that encompasses a great swatch of the nation, the states of California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Arizona, and Colorado. The diversity of the territory and in some of the greatest places to talk about climate and environment, such as the state of Alaska, how wonderful and vast that state is. And then, of course, the state of California is pretty large itself, and then the Rockies of Colorado and all of those things. And what we have been trying to do from our perspective is to make sure that people understand that the environment, the climate are not just esoteric notions, but it's really how we live and breathe each and every day. It's the quality of our air, it's how we're impacted with the shifting in the climate as relates to people who may be living in areas that are more prone to flooding. And so how do we make this conversation pragmatic and people can get their arms around it and understand that as believers and people of faith, we are charged with responsibility to care for the earth. You know, the scriptures teach us that the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, and they that dwell therein. So from the very outset in creation, humanity has been tasked with the responsibility of caring for the earth. It's really our primary charge to care for the earth, to be in relationship with the creator and sustainer of all of life, and to embody it in such a way that others will see that we are not just professing the faith, but practicing the same.
Well said, well said. And Seth, if you could introduce yourself and talk about your points of view on food and the role of food, climate, et cetera.
Sure, and thank you, Geof. So nice to be with you all. So I guess I have to plead guilty to being a serial entrepreneur, but I do think of myself as an activist much more than an entrepreneur. And for me, entrepreneurship is a way to act upon the issues that I care about, and obviously issues around sustainability, around the health of our total population, and also social justice as well. And so it started for me with Honest Tea 22 years ago, and then evolved to getting involved with Beyond Meat, and then launching a new enterprise called Eat the Change. And I'll talk a little more about that in the future in a bit here. But, you know, I think what's striking to me at this moment, because I've worked in the tea industry, I obviously had a presence in China, and there's the Chinese word for crisis it's actually two characters. It's Wei Ji. It's one of the characters is danger, and one of the characters is opportunity. And so, you know, that's what's going on here. We have real danger. There's danger to our health. There's certainly danger to our economy, but there's also an opportunity as well. I believe this is a moment to really pivot. And I think the things that come out of, or I'd like to think the things that come out of this crisis are a sense of connectedness. People realize that the decisions we make, that including the food we eat, has a direct impact on what happens, not just in our own bodies, but to literally people all around the globe. And obviously, when we look at a zoonotic disease like the coronavirus, that is the result of something that's happened in terms of our relationship to animals. But I think the other thing I hope would like to think comes out of this is a recognition that the facts matter. And so no matter what some leaders may claim about what's going on, there is real science that we need to pay attention to. And I hope we gain more respect for the science underlying climate change. And because the impact of these facts are impacting our lives in such a material way.
So thank you all for the introductions. And as I said, I want this to be as hands-on and as relevant as possible. So question for Seth and for Katharine. Do you know of any programs that are doing an effective job of reaching out to young people on food and diet? You know, part of this is how do you train the next generation? And there's a massive conversation right now about plant-based and reduction of meat consumption. But when you guys think of youth and next generation, if you could wave a magic wand, Seth and Katharine, what would you be doing differently with the youth in this country? Seth?
Well, I'll go first. We have actually seen a really exciting response among young people to both plant-based diets, and what's really striking when you look at businesses, not just Beyond Meat, but this restaurant chain we've started called Plant Burger, to look at the engagement around Instagram and around and just social media. Young people absolutely got the memo about the role plant-based diets can play. And so they are far more passionate, far more engaged. And by the way, what's perhaps most exciting is it's easy to assume, well, this is just the white suburban, but that's not really the case at all. There's really much multiracial, multicultural embrace of plant-based diets going on, and they're indexing far higher than the boomers and the older generation. So I'm very optimistic about young people being able to drive change here. And the only thing I'll mention, we've as part of Eat the Change, we have made a grants program, and we've awarded over 30 different grants to nonprofits around the country that are working at the community level to support conversion towards more planet-friendly diets, and a lot of these are working directly with youth and communities, and really doing it in a powerful and inspiring way. So the reason I'm optimistic is because what I see happening with the younger generation.
And Katharine, what's your experience with youth and diet?
Well, I don't work with diet per se, but with youth, I think there's a really important role for their voices. For so long, people were saying to me, how can I make a difference? I'm just one person. And now, no longer can we say that, because we know that if you just take a piece of cardboard and you write a few words on it and you go and you sit outside a building, in a couple of years, the entire world might know your name. And of course, that name would be Greta, because every single voice counts. And as she would say, I think no one is too small to make a difference. And our kids have shown us that.
That's great. And Bishop, are you doing any youth-oriented programs in your work? And what is a church and what can religious groups be doing more to bring young people into this conversation?
Well, the truth of the matter is the young people are leading the conversation. When you look at what's been happening in terms of the protests, it's been primarily the young people, which is not unusual. Even during the 60s and the civil rights, people forget that King was a very young man. I mean, he was dead at 39 or so. And so John Lewis, who just passed away, he perhaps had his greatest impact in change as a very young man. I mean, and so young people are leading it. And as I would contend, that's really what's happening in the change is built for them. Many of us, Geof, are still resistant to online banking and to things that are happening virtually. We are sweating bullets about virtual education and online. When the young people, that's their thing. They would rather text than talk. So I think when we talk about young people, they are with it. They are the ones that are excited about the bicycle paths and the bicycle trails that are being created. They're the ones that are more interested in eating healthy and plant-based food. I mean, my children never even embraced drinking soft drinks. And I mean, now they're 30 and 36, and it's never been a part of their diet. So I think what we have to do as adults is kind of get out of the way and stop trying to be dinosaurs and hold on to a past that's no more, and help them as they continue to be advocates and practitioners of this, what I call New World Order. The whole Novus Ordo Seclorum that's on the back of the dollar bill. I mean, money and all of these things, and being clean and washing hands and staying a distance away. I think they're already there. In the church's role, we too have to begin to look at a new way of being. No longer will we gather in buildings like we used to and pack in for services. Now, most even funeral services, which my community has always been big on, they're happening at grave sites. And that's been going on for years, but we're just coming on to it. And young people are very comfortable with it.
And Geof, if I could just build on the bishop's point, I think that's exactly right, that people of our generation may feel like, well, meat has to come from a cow and milk has to come from a cow. And I think young people have when you don't, there's no landline, so a phone is whatever you have in your pocket, and you don't own a car, you sort of can wave someone on the street. It's far easier for them to say, well, meat can be any assembly of proteins and fats. It doesn't have to be. It could come from a plant, and the same with milk. So I think that's right. They have a much more flexible mindset and adapt and accept new realities more quickly.
So kind of a pseudo-provocative question. How do we make sure they vote, right? This is something I'm very passionate about. And I think you guys, we've all seen the statistics. I think something like 10 to 12 million environmentalists didn't vote in 2016. And a lot of young people didn't vote in 2016. So personally, I'm kind of going off script here, but the thing that keeps me awake at night is I see the young people marching the streets, and my heart bleeds for the sense of frustration and anger that manifests in the fall. And to be clear, this isn't a partisan issue. It's that if we want our government to work, people need to participate. And we're at a point now where we're facing some critical issues. And so I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on it. I'll just say that I think all of us collectively need to be doing anything we can to get everybody to the polls this fall, right? I think it's a critical issue for climate. Reverend, Bishop, let me go to you. Does the church typically get involved in get out the vote campaigns?
I'm sure you're asking a rhetorical question, correct?
I'm just sharing.
Of course. There are several things. I was on a call on Tuesday called Lawyers and Collars. And it's a coalition between attorneys who are faith and embracing the faith, coupled with clergy who are motivating people to vote, and not just get out to vote, but also have an eye on those who are trying to suppress the vote by eliminating polling places and doing other things that requiring ID. Also, it used to be where we had souls to the polls. That's, we would leave church on Sunday and could go for early voting. But because it was so effective, there are those who are now trying to suppress all of those activities. But, I've been suggesting to people to have what I call, some people have watch parties. I said, let's have a registration party. Because one of the things that COVID has done, it has driven a lot of things online and virtually. So you don't have to just get up now and go to a place. You can do registration online. You can vote online in certain states. And so I'm encouraging people, let's take advantage of this opportunity where we have things at our fingertips. You don't have to always now have transportation to get to the polls. You can do it from your own house, or you can mail in your votes. And so I think, let me say, the church has always been very active in trying to motivate people first to register and then to vote. But we have to show our young people how it's pragmatic. I think, again, John Lewis is advocating good trouble. If you're going to get in trouble, make sure it's good trouble. But he did that as a young man. I mean, much of what has happened has been done by younger people. And so if they see how pragmatic that is, and so John Lewis went from being a protester heading up the SNCC organization, the Student Nonviolence group, to becoming a congressman. So he saw it. And what we have to do is help young people see the connection between what they are doing protesting and how policy is ultimately impacted, even to the courts. We have to make sure that we keep an eye to that. And I think, Geof, and I conclude with this statement, and I don't know what Seth and Katharine think about it, but our generation, we have not been effective in communicating to our young people the necessity of doing these things and understanding process. I used to say to my children, you know, milk does not grow in the refrigerator. There's a process to get it from the cow, if you're going to use cow milk, to, you know, you got the Louis Pasteur and the pasteurization process, getting it to the grocery store. Then somebody has to go get it and buy it. Well, our young people don't always see the necessity of process. And so we've got to help them with the process of electoral participation as well.
Katharine, thoughts?
I'm actually Canadian. And growing up, what really mattered for me was recognizing that my vote counted. Yeah. We have much smaller ridings in Canada than we have giant districts in the United States, but actually feeling like I could make a difference, that I could know what the candidate was standing for, that I could communicate with them, that made a difference to me. And you know what? You can do that in the U.S. too. You can communicate with your candidates. And if you're able to vote, they want to hear from you. So just making sure people understand that they are able to do this as part of the democratic process, even at a young age, is really encouraging. And as the bishop said, doing it together as a community, bringing people along, familiarizing them with the process of registering, of voting, of communicating with their elected representatives, doing things together is much better than doing things alone.
Seth, any comments on civics in America?
Well, it's critical to get the vote out, and we're pulling out all the stops. So the plant-based community, we're partnering, a group of us, and we're with a campaign called Plant Your Vote. And we are actually at the restaurant I mentioned, we're going to be, anyone who can show that they recently registered to vote gets a free burger. So we really want to do everything we can to make it an incentive and to get people engaged. It's critical.
Right, and let me just add to this. Let me put in a plug. I believe Eco America is partnering with a group called Vote.org, nonpartisan group, very effective. And Bishop, to your point, they are particularly good on the digital tool, right? They're only about 5 years old, so they're not a legacy civics organization. They're built for this age. They have some of the best tools in the business relative to remote balloting, online balloting, mail-in ballots, et cetera. So if any of you are interested in this topic, Vote.org is actually a partner of Eco American. They're doing a fantastic job. The other insight I would give to all of you is, if you know companies, small, medium, large businesses, one of the top reasons why, especially young people and low-wage workers don't vote in this country, is they don't have time off to vote. Only 42% of companies in the United States give their employees a day off. What does that mean? If you're making $12 an hour, $8 an hour, $14 an hour, you can't afford to wait 5 hours in line, which is what it will be in the fall, sadly, to vote. So for any of you that care about this topic, I would heed the wisdom of the panelists. There's a group called Vote.org. That's a wonderful one. You don't have to partner with them, but seek out some of these groups and let's see what we can to channel all this energy and frustration. Katharine, I wanted to move to you. There's a question that came in that is right on your wheelhouse, and I was going to ask you this anyway. It says, climate change still isn't a salient issue for many Americans. What do you see as missing to raise the priority of climate change in Americans' mind? And I would add, when you think of, you know, I don't know if, could you comment on the state of play of climate deniers? You used to hear that term all the time. I would like to think it's moved somewhat, but clearly there are people that will see this situation. Okay, so launch, Katharine. Tell us how we should talk to these groups. How do we kind of find common ground?
Sure. So first of all, what most people don't realize is almost 60% of people in the United States are already either concerned or even alarmed about climate change. 60%. And for those of us who are maybe concerned but not alarmed, or who are cautious but not concerned, it isn't because we don't have the right values, it's because we haven't connected the values we have to climate change. As I mentioned earlier, climate change is a threat multiplier. So it takes every issue that's already at the top of our priority lists, whether it's feeding our family, whether it's having an economy that provides us with a job and a safe place to live, whether it's inequity and injustice, whether it's our faith, whether it's the military or national security. Whatever issue we're already concerned about at the top of our priority list, climate change already affects that. So what we're missing is simply connecting the dots between what we already care about and how it's affected by climate change. That's what we need to move people up from disengaged, cautious, or concerned to alarmed, because it affects us all. At the very end of the spectrum, though, we still have 10% of the population who is dismissive. In other words, they will dismiss anything. They will dismiss 10,000 pages of scientific studies. They will dismiss 1,000 scientists. They will dismiss the evidence of their own eyes. They will even say that a heat wave wasn't hot, or that the thermometer in their backyard didn't tell them it was too hot. Why are they doing that? It isn't because they truly disbelieve 150 years of very basic science. It's because they fear that the solutions to climate change pose a greater threat to their ideology, to their welfare, to who they are, to their identity, than the impacts. But if we say it's real and I don't want to fix it, that makes us a bad person. So psychologically, our defense mechanism is to say it can't be real. Because if it were real, of course we should fix it. But the solutions, I think, are so terrible. And people even say, they say, well, the solution means we have to destroy the economy. I'm sure Seth would say that that's not the case at all. Or the solutions, I've even heard people say the solution is abortion, just kill all the babies. And of course, most people of faith would not endorse that type of solution either. But the real solutions are beneficial for us to actually restore a sense of justice and fairness, to have a much healthier economy, to reduce air pollution and water pollution, to grow jobs. There's more jobs in the solar energy industry than there is in the fossil fuel industry in the United States. So when we talk about real solutions, that's often what take people who are dismissive or doubtful and helps move them up too, addressing the direct fear they have on solutions.
Thank you. That's a very thorough answer. And another question came in that I'll pose to all of you because it's very relevant. So we're believers, we're concerned, we have an acute sense of urgency. But clearly COVID is dominating the headline and dominating everyone's attention, right? The travel industry, the government, the consumers, education. Could you all just respond to what do you think can be done to balance the perspective on COVID, the acute and rightful focus on COVID relative to climate? Is climate crowding? Is COVID climbing crowded? Is COVID crowding climate out of the headlines? Seth, and what do we do about it?
No, I actually think they are complementary. First of all, look at what COVID has done in terms of changing the way we live. It's so powerful. Think of all the different patterns of behavior we've changed in such a short amount of time. And in a way, the climate crisis never really could provoke that kind of action. But I believe a lot of the things, and we're seeing it, if you look at the plant-based meat category, it has grown dramatically since the COVID crisis. And because I do think it makes it easier for people to connect the dots. And one of the reasons we chose the words "eat the change" for this brand is because we want the call to action. We want people to recognize we've got to make changes. And I do think people are embracing change. And so I think they can. I think they are complementary, and I think it's kind of on the onus of leaders to help connect these dots. So I don't feel threatened or sidelined by it. I feel, if anything, validated. The concerns that we've been voicing for years are really coming, affecting the way we live.
Katharine, would you agree with that? I see your head nodding.
Absolutely. I would say that, again, the reason why we care about climate change is the same reason we care about the coronavirus. It's because it affects our health, it affects our safety, it affects the economy, it disproportionately affects people who are already marginalized and vulnerable. It is the exact same thing that matters to us. And so I feel like in many ways, the pandemic has shown us why we care about climate change, but it's also shown us that we can live a different way. I mean, we are doing this right now on Zoom instead of by flying to Washington, right. D.C. Right. We are seeing major cities have huge pedestrian areas. We are seeing huge investments in green growth all around the world and as part of the recovery from the pandemic. We are actually recognizing that we've lived the same way. In some ways, we're stuck the same way we've been living for well over 100 years, but there's a different way to live. We have the ability, we have the technology, and now I think we have the reason to look at how we live too. And so rather than competing with each other, I do see them as ultimately showing us why they both matter so much, and how, again, no matter what we feel divides us, whether we speak a different language or live in a different country or look different or believe different things than each other, no matter what divides us, what unites us is far more than any of that. And that is a message I feel like we need today more than ever.
Right. And Bishop, I want you to comment on that, but I also want you to lead a conversation on racial justice. As we think about Floyd and the reaction and everything that's happening, we've talked a lot about COVID, but clearly the other thing that's dominated the headlines the past 6 weeks has been the tragic death of George Floyd. So could you maybe react to what Katharine just said, but tell us your views on the intersection of climate and racial justice in the U.S. right now?
Sure. I want to first concur with both Seth and Katharine in terms of their perspective, but just push the envelope a little further to say COVID has really been the catalytic force to draw our attention to many issues that have gone unnoticed. Virtual relating is not new. It's just that COVID has made it necessary for us to do it now as opposed to 10 years from now. If you look at online banking, if you look at virtual meetings, it was there. We just chose not to take advantage of it, but to continue to get on a plane. I mean, I live on the West Coast, and much of what I had to do was East Coast or abroad. I had to fly to Geneva for World Council of Churches meeting. They would have these meetings in various places around the world, and people would get on planes and they would go, and we would be exhausted and falling asleep in the meetings and all of these things. And now I can sit in a trustee board of a college meeting and never leave my study, right? And so the things that have been happening, distant learning and remote education, is not new. I mean, you've got institutions like Phoenix University and Strayer, and those of us who had the formal education on the college campus, we kind of look side-eye at it, but now even the institutions are having to do it. And when you look at the cost that's associated with much of the way we used to do business, it was astronomical to have a convention. I mean, millions of dollars, millions. And the only people that profited were the hoteliers and those kind of people. But everybody else, they didn't get any benefit as a result of it. And so COVID, in many ways, has been a blessing. I've gotten more rest during COVID than I have probably in my adult life. I mean, I moved out here 3 years ago, Seth, and you wouldn't believe this. On April 1st of 2017, I moved into this house. And until COVID hit in March of this year, I had not spent 5 straight nights in my bed.
Wow.
It's crazy. I mean, crazy. And now I can go to bed, I can get up early and do what I have to do. So it's been a blessing in many ways. Now, as it relates to racial justice, I think what we've seen in this country, and if we're honest with ourselves, racism is principally and primarily an American phenomenon. I travel extensively, and people are more concerned about the language you speak than the quantity of melanin which permeates the pigmentation of your skin. It's only in this country and culture where that's first and foremost. And it is so intricately woven, most people don't even know they're racist. I mean, little things. You have a person who goes into Walmart, and Walmart is checking the receipt as you exit. If you're a person of color, you have to have that receipt. But the Caucasian coming behind you said, oh, no problem, just go on. That's racist. We can go into a bank, same deposits in an account, and we can't even borrow against the money we have in the account. We have to jump through so many hoops, get this piece of paper, that piece of paper, all because of the color of our skin. So the George Floyd has just brought to the surface what's always been here. Geof, if we knew the number of people who were killed by police, we would be astounded. Not until body cams and people had video cameras on their cell phones, and this stuff has come to light. We're getting now the McLean case out of Colorado that happened several years ago that's now coming to the light. But I want to say this before I go further with the racist piece. Economics underlies all of this. Even with elections. Now, this is going to be very controversial. People buy elections all the time. All the time. Right? And it's not necessarily illegal, but if you're going to get your message out, you're going to have money to do television advertisement, all the kinds of things to mobilize the vote. And if you are categorically excluded from the economics, then you're at a disadvantage. And I would say the biggest component of racism is economics, because people who have the goal makes the rules. And so if we keep people of color without capital to do things, then you render them ineffective. So let's not talk about the black or whiteness of it. Let's talk about the green of it. And I guarantee you, if George Floyd had a legitimate $20 bill, as opposed to being speculative that he had a fraudulent $20 bill, the police wouldn't have had their knee on his neck. And until we can get the capacity to be on an even keel with access to capital, which means, Geof, we have to have our own, we will constantly be dealing with this question of race.
Thank you, Bishop.
And climate.
Very passionate. And Katharine, any thoughts? You're Canadian, but you've obviously observed what's happened here. Any thoughts on the nexus between the climate movement and the racial justice movement right now?
Yes, I would echo what the bishop said, in that I feel like the situation that we are in so many ways has raised awareness of the many injustices that we just somehow have taken for granted over years and decades. So when it comes to the impacts of a changing climate, women and children are affected more than men. People of color, minorities, indigenous people are affected more than people in wealthy countries. 10% of the richest people in the world produce 50% of emissions. And even leaving climate change aside, if we just think about air pollution, most of which comes from fossil fuels, and then some of it comes from people who are too poor to afford energy, so you have to burn dung or brush inside your house and it pollutes inside your kitchen. Air pollution kills almost 9 million people per year. In the United States, it kills 200,000 people per year. And somehow we have gotten to the point where we see those deaths, which occur predominantly among marginalized, poor, and communities of color in the US. We've come to see those deaths as the acceptable price we pay for using fossil fuels. So I feel like things are starting to change. We start to recognize that there's a connection between air pollution, between coronavirus, because it makes us more vulnerable to diseases like that. And we're starting to recognize that so many injustices have been woven into the fabric of our society. It's time to do something about them, not just for the good of a few, but for the good of all of us.
Great. And then we've just got a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask one question of all of you, looking for brief answers. This is from the audience. There are many people that trust humanity's ingenuity to the point where they seem complacent with the current trajectory of climate change and are disinterested in promoting change. How should we convince individuals that their personal intervention is necessary? So the last question, just 30-second response. What can people do? What is the call to action to this audience to make a difference on climate immediately? Seth?
Mine's easy. It's eat the change. It's think about the fact that every day, every meal, you're making a vote for your impact on the climate. And when you can make mindful choices, you'll have a far bigger impact than any other thing, perhaps only aside from voting. But to have a daily impact is empowering and needed.
Katharine, real impact.
The number one most important thing I think that we can do is actually talk about it, because surveys show we don't. So even if we think it's serious, even if we think we should do something about it, we never talk about it. So that's what I actually did for my TED Talk. I talked about how to talk about climate change. It's not intimidating. You don't have to talk about the science. You can say, hey, I had a Beyond Meat burger and it tasted great. You should try one too. Or, hey, I'm going to register to vote because climate change matters to me. Why don't you do it too? Talk about what you're doing, talk about what other people are doing, talk about why it matters to us, where we live. Every single one of us has a voice that we can use.
Great. And Bishop?
I think we have to, I concur with all that Seth and Katharine have said, but I think we also have to do things like stop using plastic. You know, this is not rocket science. So let's demystify climate. Let's talk about it in real terms, things that people can put their hands on and get their head around, and let people know that everything you do impacts the climate in one way or another. And so start changing your patterns. So if you go to a grocery store, which will soon be over, we'll do everything online, but when you go and say, people say, do you want paper or plastic? Simple answer, paper.
Great. So Bishop, thank you. Katharine, thank you. Seth, it's wonderful to meet you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geof.